Okay, so yes, as the title makes pretty clear. Oh, I did want to say that now that you've had a chance to hear Badisha and Aaron, you now know there was no fix, right? We're all clear about that, right? So, and I just also wanted to say how lucky I am to have colleagues who are just so extraordinary in what they do, and it's a privilege to work with them. So thank you for your presentations. So Diana and I, I used to have an office in the inside of the AQ, and we actually met because Diana has had a beautiful Corgi Buster, and she would walk him around the AQ, and so that's how we originally met. But it was only recently we sat down, well, because of this, I guess, and started to talk to each other about our teaching, and we realized we had a lot in common. Yes. So we decided we would present together, sort of bouncing off each other a little bit, to talk about the things that we do, because we do some very similar things and slightly different things. So hopefully this works. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start with Elise telling you about how she introduces her students to her 100 level History of Sexuality course.
Right. Okay. Oh, and I do need to let you know that I changed the last thing I'm going to talk about, just so you know. Okay. Okay. So that's actually what I'm going to do. But I have to say, speaking of masks, I feel totally unmasked because the stuff. First I wanted to give you a warning and say that when I sent my PowerPoint slides to Diana and told her this is what I'm going to show, her response was, "Oh, I'm going to show a penis too." So that's your trigger warning. So I am going to show you things like that, and I have absolutely no problem showing my students that, and I love to show my students that. But when I show the same slides to other people, I feel completely naked and totally exposed and unmasked.
And just to let you know, I'm not actually showing a real penis. I know Elise has gotten your hopes up, but mine is a bit tamer.
Okay, so I teach a course called Introduction to the History of Sexuality, and some of my students who've taken that class are here today, so thank you for coming. And I figure that a lot of students who sign up for this class think it's going to be easy, right? After all, they have a lot more knowledge about the subject than, say, the history of pre-Confederation Canada, right? So in the first lecture, I have one goal, and that goal is to pull the rug out from under them, to push them off the edge of their operating assumptions, to flag to them that it is precisely because they think they know something about the topic that this will be the hardest class they ever take, because they have to unlearn everything they think they know about sex. So I'm just going to show you a very deeply condensed version of how I go about pulling the rug out from under them. So this is the opening slide to the class, and so I'm just going to show a couple quotes that I use to introduce them to how we think about sex. But we begin by talking about what is sex. What's really, everybody in this room will remember the Bill Clinton denying he had sex with Monica Lewinsky. And at the time, I was a research associate at the Kinsey Institute, and one of the women there did a study of university students there, and indeed, the majority of them said oral sex is not sex. So we kind of get down to this idea that sex is the penetration of the penis into the vagina, that this is a kind of fundamental description of sex. It's a little bit more expansive, but that's kind of where we end up. So then we go from sex as an act to, how can society haunts the body's sexuality? Like, what does that mean? And I'm sure you all know, so I'm just going to keep going here. This is Gore Vidal, and I love it. So this is one way I unsettle them. In an interview, he was asked, who was your first sexual So imagine, right, that it being completely irrelevant. Like, imagine that. And this takes us to where Foucault actually ends the history of sexuality, which is that it's a question of pleasures and desires. That's where, I don't say that in the class. That's for fourth year. But I put that idea in their head, that it's really, pleasures and desires. And imagine that the gender or the sex of the person didn't matter. So then I introduce them to some concepts. So you can see it's very basic introductory level. And this is the problem we always have. It is and it isn't, right? which is where I end up with the question. I'm not going to do it in this class, but does reading gay history make you gay? And I say yes and no. It depends. So, okay, then, so here I have Foucault and a quote from him. Okay, so now we're at the end of the lecture. And so we've introduced these thinkers and these theories and these concepts. So where does all this theorizing take us? So this is Buck Angel, who's a very famous transgender porn star. And I asked them, is this heterosexual? Because it's a penis going in a vagina. And so this is the part of my strategy to unsettle them, and it works. It really works. My other strategy was to scare them, so it would reduce enrollments and I would have less marking. But that doesn't happen. I think they might be a little scared, but they come back. Okay, so that's how I begin with unsettling them in that class.
Do I just press this?
Just that one to move it forward.
Okay, great. So it may seem that Elise's class and mine may have very little in common. I teach restoration and 18th century English literature, which may seem quite different. So as opposed to Elise trying to disabuse her students that they think they know about sex until they come into her class, I'm actually trying to deal with students who think that they know absolutely nothing about 18th century literature, and that they have some attitudes that they bring to class often. The first attitude that I usually get is that it is dry. 18th century literature is dry. And my theory is that they get this because John Dryden is one of the prominent writers, and so I think they just lop off the second part of his name and come in with this preconception. The second preconception that they have is that it is sexless. As a teacher of 18th century literature, I tend to find that any literature that was written before the 20th century tends to be lumped into this big category called Victorian. There's Shakespeare, but then everything else is Victorian, and by Victorian I mean the kind of repressed sexuality that the Victorian age has come to represent. Now, of course, Elise down the hall teaching the history of sexuality is showing them that that's not the case, but nevertheless, they think that we're just going to be talking about flowers and sheep. They're not in an interesting way about sheep. So Elise, where you are asking your students to unlearn what they think they know, I'm asking students to acknowledge their lack of knowledge and any resulting biases. So I want them to leave the first lecture bias-free. So I usually have them write down a few words that represents their preconceptions of 18th century literature, and then I say, we're not going to look at these until the end of the class. So just register this. Then I issue a warning. And the warning is that if they get offended easily, then this literature is not for them. I make the case that there are no bad words. There's no such thing as bad words. There may be bad times to use certain words, but writers of the Restoration in particular find very good uses of bad words in their poetry, plays, and prose. As it happens, I just came from teaching a lecture on the Earl of Rochester, who is kind of the worst of the worst. And I've just been teaching his poem called The Imperfect Enjoyment. And here's where the penis comes in. This is a literary penis, I'm afraid. But so this poem it's one of the most beautiful poems out there, and it's also one of the filthiest, if we're going by that kind of terminology. But this poem features a male speaker who attempts to have sex with a woman, but instead suffers from premature ejaculation. Now, this is a very common theme, particularly in Restoration theater, and in prologues and epilogues. In these prologues and epilogues, often an actress would make fun of older men in the audience by, teasing them about perhaps being impotent, and maybe that's why they don't like the play, etc. So in Rochester, he has this man who has this problem, and first he blames the woman, and then he starts trying to buck himself up about past exploits that his penis has enjoyed. And finally, and I tell them, we're used to hearing about penises in daily life. They're just everywhere. But the change here is that he ends up talking to his penis. And he curses his penis and says, "Mayest thou ne'er piss who didst refuse to spend." You're not going to have any fun just discharging your duty because you messed up. And so I use this, I think it pretty decisively throws my students' preconceptions about dryness out the window. And so Elise, if your job is to disabuse your students from thinking they're experts, my job is to disabuse them and show that, in fact, Restoration and 18th century literature deals head-on with many of the same issues that our students are currently dealing with. Sex being an important one. Another thing that I'd like to say is the 18th century is considered the great age of satire, and I think we're actually living in another great age of satire right now. I like to compare John Stewart to Jonathan Swift, because I actually think that one of the items that Jonathan Swift proposes in Gulliver's Travels is he creates this invention called flappers. And flappers are meant for intellectuals who have their heads in the clouds all the time. So the flappers actually trail behind these intellectuals and use this machine that flaps their ears so that they can actually pay attention to their environment. And I think you can guess where I'm going with this. I think this would really prevent a lot of accidents from people texting and all around. So basically my goal is to make 18th century literature a bit less remote and a bit more pertinent to their lives. So in this middle section, we moved on from beginnings. In the middle section, we've both chosen to highlight one way in which we use digital technologies in our teaching. So Elise is going to talk about interracialintimacies.org.
Okay, thanks, Diana.
Oh, whoops.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm just going to do this here. I wanted to do a little shout out to TLC because what I'm going to show you now, I built with a grant from the Teaching and Learning Center. So,
it's not coming up. Let's see if we can get it on this.
Okay, I'll let you work on that. Okay, so last year I completed an article based on oral history and archival research that I had undertaken. And once I was done with it, I wanted to do something more with my material. In oral history, oral history is, a lot of it, yeah, there we go, comes out of a community context. And the idea of oral history is it's meant to empower the communities that you're writing the history about. So the idea is to share them. And so initially what I was simply going to do is share these oral histories with the Multicultural History Society of Ontario. It was a Toronto-based history. And have them put them online. They've got a lot of their stuff online. But I thought, I kind of want to do more with them than just that, because I want to make sure people are actually using them and listening to them, because as you'll see in a moment, what I found was really interesting, especially in the history of the migration of people of Chinese heritage. It sort of changes how we think about about that history. So this is the site that I created. And as you can see, it has two parts. It has an archive, which isn't complete yet, but that's all of my research data. And when I created it, it's okay, Aaron, I can all.
See it on that,
Oh,
so
I won't, okay.
look there.
So what I created was, click there? Yeah, okay. Is this curated site that takes you through the research process from the beginning all the way through to the end to publication. And so this is something I use in my history of sexuality class. Oh, this is weird. Because you can't see it on his computer. Okay, so this is where I began, and I had a question from my master's thesis. Oh, how do I scroll? Okay.
Maybe
Trying to figure out how to.
this one.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I'll do that. I can do that. And this is the beginning of my master's thesis. And I wrote about lesbian bar culture in Toronto. So in the 50s and 60s, the bar, it's right here in this map, was right here. And this corner, this intersection was considered Chinatown. So the area, some of the people I interviewed, they lived over here. And they said, oh, I didn't live in Chinatown. So to them, people who lived there, it was really just where these shops were that they considered Chinatown. And the evidence I had come up with in my master's suggested that that the bar was, it wasn't just a matter of the bar being there, but lesbians actually had economic, social, and sexual relationships with Chinese men in the neighborhood. And that intrigued me. My master's thesis supervisor wisely said, save that for later. So I didn't include it in my master's thesis, but I just went back to it recently. So what this shows, and I think one of the reasons why I was inspired to do this website. So it has tools all along the way. So this, you can see the early evidence that I found. This is how to, and it links to other pages, how to do oral history, how to analyze photographs, and so on. And then this is how I started the process. I talked to experts. And so here's some interviews that I did. And I'll stop. I'm going to scroll through, but I'm going to stop at one point. Here's the early interviews I did with people. So I'm talking about asking them about the 50s and the 60s. So more interviews, photographs I collected. And then I meet this woman here. Okay, Mavis Chu. And she changes the direction of my research. So I'm just gonna, we don't have sound, but that's okay. Because what she's doing in this clip that I have is she's just flipping through her photo album. This is like her family album. And
Time up in that corner, you see the F?
yeah,
No, that's a flash.
okay.
There you go.
And she's talking as we're going through it. But what happened is, it became clear to, I don't. Okay, here it comes. Oh, something's going on. Oh, there we go. Okay, actually, can you go to 1 minute 50 seconds? So here I just tell the story so viewers can see it. But basically, Mavis was the daughter of a Chinese man, and her mother, what made her mother unique was her mother was upper middle class. And so here she is just flipping through her family album, and because I didn't know if I would ever see Mavis again, I grabbed my video camera and went over her shoulder and took it all in. And this is a sex worker. She's showing, this is her family album, and her family album is full of white women with Chinese men. This is the woman who was her godmother. She was married to she's a white woman married to a Chinese lawyer. That's her birth certificate up there. This is another woman, white woman married to a Chinese man. So she's flipping through this album, and I'm going, holy smokes, because in the history of Chinese migration, Chinese migrants were called a bachelor society. And the argument is that there were so few women of Chinese heritage that all these men lived single, lonely, sexless lives. And this gets narrated as part of the tragedy of racism, that they had to suffer without sex. And so what I learned by looking at this, there's not a lot of suffering going on. Like, they kind of worked it out, right? So I switched topics. So what I tell, so you can stop it there and go, just close the. So as you can see, it just goes on and on. It's all white women with Chinese men. It was amazing. So these are photographs, and maybe I'll just show you. Oh, am I going too long? I'll just show you. Sorry, I'll just show you. As you can tell, I get pretty excited about this because it's so. This is her dad, Like, I just think, oh my God. I think I would think he was a gay man. He's just so, because the way his like, his little cigarette hand there. But anyways, which goes to show, right? You can't always read the present into the past. Okay. Or maybe he had a secret side life. I don't know. That's where he worked for. But I just want to skip to one photo. This is the woman who's believed to be his wife back in China. And it was known. But there are a lot of white women didn't know their husbands had wives back in China. So there's her godmother. Now, a lot of the people I interviewed, men and women, they were all the children, right? Because these are marriages from the 20s and 30s. And they all said, there were very few of us. Just a few, just a handful. All of the people I interviewed. But what I want to show you, it's coming, it's coming. Oh, I should have gone backwards. These are all sex workers, not her. The other ones were. Okay, this is Mavis's school picture. This is Hester Howe, the school that all the local kids went to. All the Chinese kids who grew up in this neighborhood went to this school, but it's a lot of immigrant children. All of these highlighted kids are mixed race, Chinese. All of them. That's one classroom in 1 year. So how many of these relationships, right, do we think existed? Well, I found out, one of the things I found out is that the Protestant Church, Women's Missionary Society, was so concerned about the isolation of these white women because, and she doesn't say it, but we know they were isolated because the Chinese community rejected them. They're not Chinese. And the white community rejected them because they're sleeping with a Chinaman. So they were completely isolated, even though they lived in the center of one of the biggest thriving metropolises in Canada. They were so concerned about her isolation that they hired a social worker just to work with these white women. So that gives you a sense of the scope of these relationships, right? So the website, it teaches students lessons on how to do research, and the lesson here is be open to where your research might take you. So what happens is I'm doing the interview with Mavis, and she says, oh, well, it's too bad you're not, and this is the story I tell here, I think. Oh, no, here in my method. You click on these, and it tells you little stories. Oh, it's too bad you're not interested in the 30s and 40s. And I said, oh, yes, I am. What do you have, right? Because that's what you do in oral history, right? It's like, oh, you know, and so that's how she ends up telling me this story. And so that's all I'm going to say about that. I just wanted to show, oh, sorry, it's this thing here. Oh, well, you can close that for me. But the website goes all the way through. One of the things I like about it, and I'm very pleased about, is it goes all the way through the publication process. And the anonymous reviewers of my article agreed, without ever making their identity known to me, I did it through the editor, to allow me to post their reviews. And so I give advice to students on what makes a good review. And I say, these two reviews I think are excellent, and why I think they're excellent, and then how I responded to those reviews. Now, I admit that part of the reason why I did this is because I wanted to show people how much work goes into one stupid little tiny article. So I asked my students at the end of it to describe in one word the research process, and half of them said a word similar to onerous, and the other half said exciting. So I feel like I was completely successful in expressing to them, relating to them what the research process is like.
Great, thanks, Elise.
Go ahead.
So my venture into digital humanities is virtual at this point. I'm not putting up a website yet. This is because I'm starting this new project with my master's level students this term. What I'm having them do, and they all just got their training by our wonderful librarians, Rebecca Dowson and Andre Iwanchuk last night, I'm having my students make a contribution to 18th century scholarship by actually downloading plays, I should say, from the 18th century collections online. If you're not familiar with this database, this basically has facsimile editions of many 18th century British texts. And so these, of course, you know, you've got the long S, you've got all kinds of features that make them a bit difficult to read. And of course, for people with reading disabilities or visual impairments, it's hard for them to read. Plus, it's very hard to search them for keywords. So there's a group called 18th Connect that uses the program Typewrite. Now, what Typewrite does is Typewrite is a program where you can take scans of these texts, and the scans are done in OCR, and there's very many mistakes that go into this scanning process. So using the program Typewrite, you can go through one of these scans line by line and correct it, and then send the text back to 18th Century Connect. So I thought this would be a huge advantage to researchers, and it would let our students really get in deep with these texts. Instead of only reading it, they would also be reading it to correct it, and therefore have a more intimate relationship with it. Then what they will do is they will complete an entire play, which is an average of about 80 pages, going line by line, doing these corrections. And then for my class, they're going to write critical introductions of these plays. This is a great opportunity because the plays that they will choose are the less popular plays that haven't had the process done to them so far. There will also be second editions, third editions of plays that haven't been done, and so they will be uploading this to 18th Century Connect for approval and for an editorial critique. At the same time, they will be writing introduction to these plays, many of which have never had a single piece of literary criticism written about them. So I'm hoping that from this, we can actually pull some writers from obscurity and really flesh out our ideas of how vast was 18th century theater, who participated in it. We're still, of course, recovering women writers as well. And so this is the project. It's very different from what I usually do at the end of the class, which I will be talking about in just a moment. But I think it's great in terms of service learning and in terms of actually not always just writing a term paper and then filing it away in your desk drawer and finding it 7 years later when you're moving and you've got your boxes and, oh, look at this. I wrote that for Solomon's class, et cetera. So that's my virtual DH project at the moment. And now, Elise and I are going to talk about endings. I think actually you're introducing us, or does it matter?
Oh, yeah. So this one will be short. So the same class, at the beginning of the class, the very first lecture, I asked them to write down their gender, whatever it is, their age, and then I asked them to write a statement in response to the title, What I Wish I Had Known or Understood Better About Sex When in High School. And so these are some examples just from one thing. So one of the things, so the concepts I want to teach in this class are obviously the sexually constructed nature of sex and how it intersects with gender and race. Those are the main concepts and the theories. The tool or the skill that I want to teach them is primary document analysis. So as you could see, that website I showed you, what it does is it gives you all the primary documents and it says, read them, analyze them, and then at the end you see my article and you can argue against it or whatever you want. Anyhow, so they've had 3 or 4 essays analyzing primary documents. So what I do is I reintroduce their stories at the end and I say, here's your primary document. So I ask them not to write a traditional essay at all, but write a letter of advice to someone in high school using all of the data. So not just their experience. So they get data on women and men. Some students identify as trans. And they can work with that data. And then they have to present a historical argument using lecture and course material as well. So in this class, it's first year, I've read 3 essays, short essays from them already. I don't want to read any. Just, just give me a letter of advice. But there actually is a strategic plan with doing that letter of advice. And I think there's 3 specific things I want them to get from that. 1, their experience matters, right? So your own experience in high school becomes historical data. So experience matters, your experience matters. 2, that the way we make meaning from gender, sexuality, and race, or the masks that we wear, is political. And then 3, that history is one way we can empower ourselves in the present. So those are the 3 things I want them to get out of this very personal closing exercise. So hopefully it's a way to not only bring home all the ideas, but also take them on in a very personal way. And you?
Great. And I'm going to sound like the retrograde teacher here because I'm actually going to make a case for the essay. I think the essay is really important. I feel like one of the most important skills that I can impart to my students is the ability to write and to write argumentatively. In these days where people often make their first impressions of you via email rather than in person or over the phone, I think it's really important to be able to command your words well on the page. So in my upper division classes and in my grad classes, I assign term papers where they have to go out and do some research, build an argument, and defend it in their essays. Students usually think that this is the most boring thing. And so my goal is to actually show that it is, I think, one of the most creative spaces for them to express ideas. So some things that I do to get that across is I always have a title contest because I tell them, okay, so I've received papers and the title on them has been paper. I'm like, well, that just doesn't make me want to read your essay. And then I'll say, okay, well, the others will say paper number 1. Same thing. Then I'll have people who submit essays called, for example, The Rape of the Lock. And I'll say, okay, well, Pope wrote The Rape of the Lock and you wrote The Rape of the Lock. Which one do you think I'm more interested in reading? So going through some of these examples at the outset, in fact, makes them realize that I care about the titles that they come up with. So we talk about, the necessity for a title to both be catchy and to be informative. Something, maybe there's wordplay in it, but you also have to be able to find it in a library database. Like if somebody is looking for papers on Pope, your paper has to come up. So it's got to have some clarifying information in it. And then I usually have a clap-o-meter at one of the final classes to see who wins the title contest. And I've been very impressed over the years. It's like if you just pay attention to it, then they'll care about it, and then they'll want their titles to be submitted. Maybe a few of them are modest, but nevertheless, I'm the one who picks the finalists. So that's something that I can do. Another thing that I do is, we talk about the importance of writing the body paragraphs first, of writing your way into a thesis, not just thinking of something and slapping it down on the page as the only thing you could think of. So we talk about, generating 5 to 10 possible arguments and choosing the best one. Then we talk about, how to arrange body paragraphs, how to write a conclusion. Students really don't understand conclusions, and I would say that's actually a lot of us, I think, don't understand how creative conclusions can be, how they can go far and make, additional connections to other ideas and other essays, et cetera. And then when it comes to the introduction, which they will have written last if they're following my, my advice, I have them all bring in their introductory paragraphs, which means they have to have introductory paragraphs. And then we do something called intro paragraph speed dating. So what I do is I bring in a real timer, and I set up the room so that half the students are seated on one side of the table and half on the other. And then I time them for 4 minutes. And I say, okay, during this time, you and your current partner have to say something, some word of advice or something that you are responding to that you really like, or just some piece of information that the writer can use to advance his or her introductory paragraphs. So it's the kind of thing where a lot of serious work gets done, but it's punctuated by the timer going off and, you know, kind of the giggling of, you know, okay, we have to move one chair in this direction, and all of these things. So basically, what I try to do is ultimately prioritize the word and to show them ways where they can really come to value word choice, choosing the right word for the situation. We do a lot of work on revision. I often do revision groups in class, and also I'll have a volunteer and we'll workshop that person's paper in class. What I always use as my model is the first line of Dryden's Macflecknoe, which is my favorite poem. Dryden begins this poem with the line, "All human things are subject to decay." All human things are subject to decay. And so I'll say, well, have you ever called people human things before? Why is Dryden using the word things? Dryden's one of the masters of the English language. Is he being lazy? What is he, you know, why is he doing this? Beings is clearly the word. Even though things works metrically, it's still a very odd choice for, you know, the former poet laureate of England to do. And so we spend a long time talking about that word things. You know, why might Dryden be using this word that, you know, we use as, you know, thingy or thingamajig or whatever, usually in informal situations. And so we ultimately talk about how Dryden's, you know, what I call extravagant diction ironically communicates the 18th century's obsession with decorum. Dryden is very concerned in this poem about bad writing. Macflecknoe, or son of Flecknoe, is his former friend Thomas Shadwell. And so there's all these sh with a line through it that, of course, can rhyme in the poem with both shit and Shadwell. And so we talk about, you know, just the fact that the third word of a poem can have this immediate effect on the reader, saying, okay, this is making me engage with the poem because I really don't know why Dryden is using this word. And so what I try to prioritize, and, you know, retro as it sounds, is the creativity that goes into writing a term paper. The fact that here you have a chance to advance your argument, that your argument can be so creative, and that you need to use the best chosen language to express it. So I hope that my students, you know, I know many of my peers in the English department do these wonderful final projects, and which are so creative. My colleague Tiffany Worth told me a few years ago that somebody had made a game of the Fairy Queen, and so we sat down and played it for 2 hours. So I think all of that is great. My particular angle on it is that what we already have can be used more and more thoroughly to communicate, and that's my ultimate goal. So, thank you.